The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we are going to continue with our lecture of the biological basis of behavior and their relationship with what we know today in psychology. Now, in previous lectures and other videos, we have talked about aspects of chemical communication and how that allows for the exposure, or it allows for the influence in our behavior. So for example, through the process of neurotransmission, we talked about the exact steps and components that go into neurotransmission. We also talked about neurotransmitters. We talked about that influence within the neurotransmitters, and also we spoke about hormones and their influence in behavior. So if you had not had the opportunity to look into these lectures, I highly recommend that you go to the description down below and you become acquainted and familiar with these types of lectures and information. Today, we're going to continue with the genetic components of behavior. Particularly, let's talk about the research methods that we utilize in order to conduct genetic studies. So let's go to our slides. Now, one of the things that we do is that we make use of participants that are twins, because with twin participants, we both have identical twins, which share the same genetic makeup, and fraternal twins, which they share some of that genetic makeup, just like siblings would, whereas identical twins will share the same exact genetic information. This is immensely useful because in regards to identical twins, we can determine whether or not, for instance, there is a genetic or strong genetic suggestion that a specific trait came from their genetics and not necessarily from nature, from nurture, I should say, from their environment. Whereas with fraternal twins, what we can understand is see whether or not these differences may come from environmental or nurture factors. So notice in the example that we have to the right of your screen, notice that we have two of these specific traits or characteristics. So for example, we have intelligence and personality, and more specifically in regards to extroversion. Notice that the score of correlations, meaning the closer a score is to 1, the higher or more likely that correlation is to be strong, right? So no correlation would be 0, and a strong correlation would be 1. So notice that there is a significantly high correlation, right? So it appears it's at the 0.85 level. And notice that there is a relationship between the fact that these individuals are identical twins and intelligence. And also, there seems to be a moderately high relationship between that genetic makeup of intelligence and those who are fraternal twins. Now, there is an interplay. We have come to understand that our behavior, that our mental illnesses, that issues with mental health, or the way we carry on in our daily lives, so for example, a personality, notice that there is a component between and within a combination of both nature and nurture. So for example, the genetics that an individual comes with from birth, those traits, plus the influence that the environment can have towards those traits. So notice that some individuals would say, well, intelligence comes from your genes, or some people say, no, it comes from your nurture, the school you went to, the opportunities and the means that you had to learn and study. But notice that as we come to understand, normally that debate has been settled down and has been put out in has been tested because now we understand that genetic factors and environmental factors do play a significant role in our behavior. Now, if we go back to our slides, we also make use of epigenetics as a means to study if these factors that are hereditary, these changes in our genes, in the expression, mind you, and this is very important, in the expression of genes that do not necessarily involve modifications to that DNA sequence. Now, notice that there is a chance that specific genes, that these effects can be damaged or can be silenced by chemical events at the cellular level. And if we have changes at the cellular level, there is a chance that that genetic expression may not manifest itself, that it may be silenced. In other words, that it can remain dormant, if you will, in more of a layperson's term. So notice that this study is involved in seeing whether or not this type of silence has occurred. Now, if we go back to our slides, there's many ways in which we can indeed stimulate those chemical events, and that is through environmental events. What do I mean by that? For example, not having adequate sustenance, particularly when the children are young, exposure to stress, among others. So what does this mean in plain old English, right? In the Queen's English. So notice that we will have, for example, and now keep in mind, there's not one single gene that is in charge of everything. Generally, as we talked in previous lectures, most things are polygenetic, I should say. But for the sake of this example, let's conduct a hypothesis, right? Let's create a mock scenario in which this person has a gene for being immensely gifted, right? A person who is highly intelligent. So that came from their nature. Now notice that there could be an issue with the side of the environment in which this person, for example, was born with the capability of being an immensely intelligent individual, but they weren't provided with the nurture resources, I should say. So for example, they were not provided with good health in the sense of nutrition. They weren't provided with good sustenance. Maybe they weren't exposed to other means of education. Notice that now, because of environmental factors, then what is the possibility that that person can actually manifest, that they can actually manifest that gene, right? That expression of that gene, if you will, as we saw earlier in our slides. So notice the person did come with the ability of being an immensely remarkable or remarkably intelligent person, but notice that because of events in that person's environment, that expression of that gene was silenced. Well, let's go back to our slides. Now, something immensely important is that we have made use in biological psychology, and there's also specific fields of evolutionary psychology. We have made use of the theory of evolution as a means to explain characteristics and how we adapt with certain behaviors. Now, the intent that Charles Darwin sought to explain, what was his motivation, his scientific quest in order to answer some of those questions, those research questions that he had? Well, ideally, the intent that Darwin had was to understand how those characteristics of a specific species change over time, right? How is it that they might change? So for example, if we have an animal, or we have an animal that behaves a certain way, and later on we see that over an extended amount of time, the characteristics of this animal started to change. And why exactly are these changes surprisingly adaptive, right? So not only How is it that these changes occur? Not only that, why are they so remarkably able to adapt to their environment? So that was the question. Those two questions was what Charles Darwin attempted to answer. So in keeping with Darwin's explanation, notice that many people use the term fitness erroneously, right? A lot of people say, well, it's the survival of the fittest. And unfortunately, when individuals use that term, they're actually not using it correctly. Because generally, when we think about fitness in lay terms, we're thinking about someone who is strong, quote. Now, fitness in the sense of an evolutionary context, it does not mean that a species or person is strong, right? Fitness, in a very basic sense, when it comes to evolution, is that that individual or that species or that animal will have reproductive success in regards or relative to the average reproductive success of the population. What does that mean? It means that an individual is able to pass down genes that are considered that or are going to help that species adapt, right? So for example, if for some reason, right, in human beings, we don't longer make use or it's necessary for our environment to make use of our index finger, right? Eventually, those traits of not being born with an index finger, right, will be an adaptation to our environment because now, for whatever reason, in changes in our environment, we wouldn't need to make use of that index finger. Now, in fitness, what would happen is that, for example, if I were that individual and I happen to have the genetic makeup that would allow me to not develop that index finger because I am adapting to my environment and it's increasing the chances of my survival, chances are that I will be able to pass that down to the next generation. Now, this is happening simultaneously with many members of my species, right? Because a species evolves as a whole. A species does not evolve with one person. So in that regard, all of us, all of the individuals that genetically are favored in regards to not developing that index finger, notice that we will have the ability to pass that down to our next generation, which in turn allows that species to be fit or able to carry that adaptation to other generations. Therefore, the animals or the individuals who were not adapting to their environment, so for example, having that index finger was detrimental for them and their survival, notice that those individuals will be phased out. They will actually die. They will actually not be part of that species, or they will become a subspecies of that animal. But how is it that we come across that selection, right? Why is it that, for example, this individual is more likely to pass down the genes versus another individual or species that is not able? Well, that is by the process of natural selection. What is natural selection? It's those characteristics that are more likely to be passed down to other generations are those that become selected. So, for example, in my case, right, if I had that gene that allows me to not have that index finger that we won't be needing anymore because it does not serve a good purpose for us to adapt to our environment, notice that in this specific regard, I will be able to pass down those genes to that individual because I have greater chances, I should say, of surviving in my environment. Now let's go back to our slides. Now keep utilizing the term adaptation. Adaptation. And what I mean by adaptation, it's basically that inherited characteristic that consequently increased in a population Because it allowed for that survival. It allowed for that reproduction, as I stated earlier. So if I am part of a herd or an animal, or I'm part of a society where, for example, not having that index finger is going to allow me to be and adapt to my environment, to be able to pass down and be able to survive in that type of environment, notice that those chances will increase. The chances of me being able to reproduce and have access to resources are greater, and therefore that would increase the chances of me being able to reproduce and pass that down to the other generation, which in turn will have the opportunity to pass down those genes. Now, there is a specific field of psychology, and that is evolutionary psychology. And we have evolutionary psychologists, I should say, and they are of the opinion that many of the aspects of human nature, many of the things that we do naturally, reflect those adaptations, those demands that our ancestors had to go through, right? Rather than contemporary demands. So what does that mean? It means that many of the behaviors that we have today, they come because of the challenges of adaptation, of that fitness that our ancestors had to go through in regards to their survival. And now it's being manifested in our own behavior, in our own survival. So think about, many individuals are prone to liking sweets, right? Many of us will crave sweets. I want to have a cupcake or a milkshake. And ultimately, most of us have that demand of calories, right? We usually meet, if not more, of the demand of calories that we should have. Now, keep in mind that that need and that craving was an adaptation that was beneficial to our ancestors because they didn't have the surplus of food that we have today. So for them to crave such high calorie and sugar content and fat diet, it was a severely important factor, a significant factor for their survival. So now we are keeping that same trait in regards to wanting and craving certain foods, because back in their day, that was not accessible, right? They depended on the hunting and the gathering and looking into resources. And there would have been an extended amount of time in which they did not have access to those resources. So let's go back to our slides. Now, something that I would like to remind you when it comes as an overview for our entire chapter, imagine, and I need you to remember that both our genes and our environment together, jointly influence our behavior, right? There's many chances in which we attempt to evaluate certain things. So for example, we start thinking about, let's think about an individual who committed a crime, right? So we have an individual that committed a crime. We're thinking, well, what was it about their genes that led them into this crime? And some people would say, well, it had nothing to do with his genes. It had more to do with his environment, his childhood, his adult experiences that led that person into crime. But notice that now that you have reviewed this chapter, learn and understand that both factors play a significant role when it comes to our expression of behavior. Now, how is this related, right? How is it that this occurs? Well, remember that the impact of that genetic makeup, right? The impact of your genes will depend on your environment, right? So think about the example that I gave you of this remarkably smart child, right? This remarkably smart child who had genes that favor higher intelligence. Remember that the genes will impact the environment and the environment will impact the genes. How is that? Well, remember, for example, in the previous illustration that I presented earlier, in the case of this child who was born remarkably smart, if you will, or gifted, notice that because that child lacked basic nourishment or lacked basic communication, or was not, it was not exposed to better education, notice that that expression therefore was silent. So in this case, the environment impacted the expression of those genes. And conversely, our genes can have an impact on our environment. So for example, notice that in the case of this child, genes will impact the child's environment. So for instance, the child seeks certain types of study materials, they pick up certain interests. So for example, STEM or math, or wants to become a researcher in social sciences, wants to become the next individual to discover new things, or they're musically gifted, musically talented. So this child would start seeking, for example, instruments at a young age. So notice that the genes impacted the environment. Now the child is looking for things in their environment in order for these genes to keep manifesting. Now let's go back to our slides. I do need you to remember that behavior is immensely complex. Behavior is immensely complex because it is determined by many causes. There is not one cause, there is not one factor, there's not one independent variable, if you will, that is going to impact behavior. Generally, what we do observe is that there are many aspects, many variables that come into play in our behavior. So for example, the way that I'm talking to you right now, the things that you do, the things that you're interested in, notice that all of these behaviors, things that you like and that you engage in, or things that you don't engage in, notice that they are going to be impacted by many factors and not just simply one. It's just that we're really prone to trying to find very simple explanations. But in reality, things are much more complex, especially when it comes to behavior. Now, let's think about an example, right? So a lot of people would say this person, it's schizophrenic because of one specific factor. But keep in mind that schizophrenia, along with other mental illnesses, involves a high complexity in a lot of biological factors that play a role in the manifestation of a mental illness. Now, something to remember is that psychology is empirical. Psychology is the scientific study of behavior with the intent of predicting said behavior. Therefore, all of our studies have to be substantiated by empirical research, right? Generally, they involve experiments, correlations, statistical procedures, and although that is outside of the scope of this lecture, keep in mind that the reason why we understand this information is because psychology is not a field that involves guesswork. It utilizes the same features and the same aspects that you would, for example, find in biological sciences that you will find in other fields. Now let's go back to our slides. Now, when it comes to our procedures, when it comes to the specializations of our brain, notice that we are going to have cognitive tasks. Now, cognitive tasks, they are going to involve aspects of both of our hemispheres. So keep in mind, first of all, we're going to talk about the left, and later we're going to talk about the right hemisphere. Now, our left hemisphere, as you remember from our previous lectures, I like to think about the left hemisphere. Starts with an L, so something that also starts with an L is language. So I like to think about the left hemisphere as things that involve language. So for example, speech and writing. As you know, math is the universal language, and logic. So I like to remember that the left hemisphere is in charge, or is highly specialized, I should say, in regards to those verbal language tasks. Now, with cognitive tasks, as it involves the right hemisphere, here we're going to have more of those non-verbal tasks. So for example, we can find aspects in cognitive tasks involving spatial problems, music, art, and fantasy, along with creativity. So notice that in regards to the right hemisphere, when it comes to cognitive tasks, what we are coming across is the nonverbal aspects of our cognitive processes. Now, we're talking about the cognitive task, but let's think about the modes of thinking. Now, in regards to the modes of thinking, let's go back to our left hemisphere. And with our left hemisphere, we're talking about an analytical method. That mode, that method that I'm going to utilize to think is generally analytic. It's rational. It's logical. Whereas that method of thinking with our right hemisphere generally is concrete, right? And it's generally intuitive. And when we're thinking about aspects that are intuitive, notice that some individuals may have a non-rational mode of thinking. Now, something that I do need to remind you is that both the left and right hemispheres, they do have some forms of specialization, but you need to remember that it's only to a certain extent, right? I don't want you to think that, oh, I'm more analytical or I'm more holistic in my ways of thinking. So if I'm more holistic, it means I'm more right brain, or if I'm more analytical, that means that I'm more left brain. Sure, there are specialties, right? Each area is specialized, but I don't want you to believe that there is that much of an extent, right? There is that specialty in a specialization in each side, in each hemisphere of the brain, but keep in mind, it's only to a certain degree. Now, if we go back to our slides, notice that there is very little evidence. There is very little evidence to support that each hemisphere will have their own mode of thinking or cognitive style. That means that, sure, they are specialized in all these fields. They are both specialized in their method of cognitive tasks and their method or modes of thinking. But you need to remember that it's only to a certain extent. We do not have enough concrete, or I should say direct evidence that these modes of thinking will be only their own, only for the left hemisphere, only for that right hemisphere. Now, because of that, when we hear individuals say, oh, I'm left brain or I'm more right brain, notice that we don't have enough evidence to support that persons are only a certain way because of their hemispheres. Notice that, for example, we may have someone who's an engineer, but that person is also very prone to music and it's very musically inclined. So we have a field that is highly analytical, but then the same person also has the ability to, for example, play the guitar. This person is musically inclined. So notice that generally we consider that to be a myth when we say, oh, I'm more left brain or I'm more right brain. So let's go back to our slides. Now, let's talk about the influence that we may have when it comes to being able to reach certain milestones, right? Because when we are developing, and keep in mind, we are always developing. Generally, when we hear the term developing, we think about infants, we think about children, but notice that we are always developing, right? We're always constantly changing. So for example, a lot of individuals who take lifespan development, right, which is the scientific study of changes and adaptations throughout the lifespan, right, since conception all the way up to death. A lot of people forget that it's beyond childhood, right, that we actually have a lifespan. We actually continue to develop afterwards. But there are instances, right, there are certain milestones, there are certain times that it is critical, that it is important that we are developing certain skills or certain tasks. So let's think about what this is, let's think about the critical period. Now, the critical period is a limited time span. It is very limited. It's an amount of time in which that specific organism has the optimal capability, and capacity for those capacities to emerge, because you are immensely responsive to certain experiences. What does that mean in the Queen's English, right? What does that mean in simple English? There are certain times in our development that we are more prone into developing a certain skill, right? That is a critical period, right? Think about a use it or lose it type of situation. So for example, there is a critical period in which an individual will learn how to talk. There's a critical period when a person will learn how to crawl, roll on his stomach or his or her stomach. There's a period when the individual will learn how to walk. So notice that that will depend in the ability of that child to have the exposure from their environment. Because as a lot of people like to mention, children will be sponges, right? That is a period in which they are more prone into learning and developing that skill. Therefore, that is a critical period, because once this critical period passes and the person did not develop that specific skill, notice that it could be immensely difficult, if not impossible, for this person to develop those skills. Now, in order to develop those skills, let's go back to our slides. Notice that the individual will have to have an enriched environment, because that enriched environment is going to aid that development. So for example, think about a child, and some of you may be familiar with the case of Jeannie, which was a child who unfortunately had some severe neglect issues, right? Her parents chose to keep her in a room and never talk to her from birth to basically until the age of almost 13, when she was found. And she had missed a critical period, because later when she had to learn how to talk at the age of 13, she was unable to learn certain characteristics and certain aspects of English grammar and syntax. So notice that she had missed that critical period. So it was impossible for her to later learn other aspects of language, and she was not able to communicate in the sense that you and I would, because we did go through an enriched environment that allowed us to communicate in, for example, whatever language you speak. Now, we go back to our slides. Now, let's look at extrapolation. Let's look at extrapolation. What does that mean? It occurs when an effect is estimated by extending beyond some known values or conditions. So we are trying to move past, right? We're trying to move past what we were expecting of that condition. And now we are trying to look into what other values, what other conditions can come into play, right? What other aspects can we utilize? This here will be the end of your lecture. I hope that this lecture was beneficial for you and that you were able to understand some of the aspects of learning, and when it also came to the evolutionary aspects of behavior. I hope that you have an opportunity to watch the other lectures, and thank you very much for your attention.